Good morning, everyone. I am Michelle Bomberger, founder and managing attorney at Equinox Business Law Group. At Equinox, we provide general counsel services for small and mid-sized companies, helping them to be more proactive about legal and business strategy and really growing their business in a smart and proactive way. We do these seminars every month with different topics that we are hearing about in the marketplace from our clients. So we bring in guest speakers, and sometimes we speak ourselves, but really we're looking for topics that are top of mind, and this one really is. So we're really excited this morning to have Juniper Rogneby from Moxie Media and Nyasha Tunduwani from Real Impact Consulting and the Black Channel Alliance. Both of them are really active in looking at what is very common and talked about right now, diversity, equity, inclusion, DEI, within their own businesses, but also within the business ecosystem, not just hiring, really looking at how do we expand our reach and diversity across all aspects of our business. And this topic came up because I was talking to a couple of clients about DEI initiatives, and really as a small company, we have very little impact from a hiring standpoint. So in talking to some folks, Nyasha and Juniper really kind of came forward with some fantastic ideas on what we can do and how we can think about this in our business. So I'm looking forward to our panel discussion this morning. A couple of just quick housekeeping items. We are recording this program. It will be posted on our YouTube channel for your future viewing. If you want to go back and take a look at it, there'll be an email that comes out after this event that includes the link, as well as any follow-up questions and materials that Juniper and Nyasha may provide. So for a quick introduction, Juniper Rogneby, she/her, is the Director of Human Resources and Operations at Moxie Media. Moxie is a direct marketing firm in the political space. They just got off of a very, very busy year. Outside of work, Juniper operates a small homestead near Season Farm on Vashon Island, where she's also a food systems activist, organizing for a robust and more equitable local food system. And I would love to talk about that on a different day. Nyasha Tunduwani is the owner and technology consultant at Real Impact Consulting. They focus on providing high quality technical support for small businesses. He's also the founder for the Black Channel Alliance Partner, which is accelerating the growth of Black innovators and technology businesses through mentorship, coaching, and community. So welcome to you both, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you, Michelle.
So as I mentioned, just to kind of kick this off, you know, small businesses and small and mid-sized companies look at the idea of DEI and they're excited about it and they want to do something. But they realize that their direct impact in hiring, which is the logical place to go first, we want our team to be diverse, is really kind of limiting. So can you talk a little bit about what DEI kind of looks like in a company? What does this idea of a diverse ecosystem look like? So Juniper, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, it can be really overwhelming. And I think, you know, the whole idea of analysis paralysis, and you're like, I know I'm supposed to do this work. I know it's really important. I'm not sure where to begin. And yes, for sure, your hiring, your kind of internal HR practices are for sure a very, very important part. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But I think deciding where to begin is probably your best bet, and not trying to check all the boxes all at once. You know, deciding to either look at some of your vendors or some of your other business partners, whether it's, if you are, you know, a lot of us are coming up now against this long-term care insurance mandate in Washington. So could I seek out a minority-owned insurance broker? So that's a tangible move that you can make. So investigation, cultivate some curiosity, and curiosity is probably a word I'm going to use a lot in these conversations, and start there. And we did that recently with a different kind of insurance that we needed. And I reached out to my network and we found a Black-owned insurance broker in Seattle. a lot of folks are then like, well, I have a Black-owned insurance broker. I guess I'm good, right? But it is a continual, it's that proverbial onion, layer upon layer, but choosing sort of an actionable step that you can take in one segment of your business, I would recommend is a great place to start.
Yeah, Nyasha, I know you've seen a lot of different ways that this plays out, both in your own business and within your relationships across the community. Can you share a couple of experiences?
Perfect. Yeah. So there's a couple of things. So I'll talk about the Black Channel Partner experience first, which is the organization I started with a few friends last year. And the names of the companies are big, but ultimately it works the same in small business. So what we did when we initially started was we looked at Microsoft, because we had a lot of relationships there. And we looked at levers that Microsoft could pull to impact equity. I don't know if many people know this, but right now, and it's been updated since the last census, so average net worth for a Black family was 17,000. And for a white family, it was 175,000. So that's the wealth gap between those two communities. So when we started the organization, we said, okay, look, we'll use Microsoft as a template and then figure out how we can relate this to other companies. And the things that we highlighted that they could address were, one, supplier diversity, right? Who they hire and the vendors they use. And the same thing applies to small businesses. The other part was who they hire and how they hire. And so that's another element that we saw as a lever. The third piece, which is actually more critical to our group because it's partner facing, is who they partner with in engagements. So for those of you that have been tracking Microsoft, their performance is off the charts over the last few years. Now, the person who manages the channel, Rodney Clark, came out and announced that 95% of their business goes through partners, right? So if they're unable to diversify their partners, which currently run at 0.05% for Black partners, then that wealth and that opportunity is not available to that community. So, you know, for me, when I look at, you know, diversifying the ecosystem, it's really helping build robust businesses in these communities. So a lot of the businesses that we're referring to don't have access to the networks that, you know, essentially most of the people in this call, myself included, belong to. Right? So without access, it means that their average dollar sale is significantly lower and the ability to build a sustainable business is significantly lower. So I think partners, suppliers, and pulling people into rooms is critical. But that's how, you know, we're viewing DEI. I think the other interesting thing, especially for small businesses that's going to come downstream, is, you know, we saw, and this was something, the recent thing with, was it Coke in Atlanta? Diversity, equity, inclusion is becoming core to everything that's happening, right? So if your small business hasn't been impacted by it yet, what's coming down the pipe is essentially the large companies that realize, hey, DEI is important for our constituents, our clients, and our new generation of employees coming up, are looking down their vendors and saying, we're going to need an inclusion strategy. So what we're seeing is that it's developing as a soft request right now, like, hey, it would be great if you had an inclusion strategy. I think going forward, there's going to be a lot more teeth to those assessments. And so I think, fortunately for the people that took the time to be on this call today, you're at the front end of what's going to ultimately affect other businesses in the future when they're vendor contracting with Microsoft, and Microsoft says, we want an inclusion strategy. And furthermore, we want you to actually implement it.
We're definitely seeing that where it's not just the direct partner with a large company, but they're implementing diversity, and then the second tier down is implementing diversity. And so if you're not paying attention to this and you're working with these larger companies, eventually you're going to be, you know, stuck or left out. One question that kind of came to mind, and Juniper, you kind of referenced this with your idea of decide where to begin, is what are the challenges to getting started? Like how you know, this seems like something in some ways that's, you know, a no-brainer, but why are companies stuck?
Oh, I mean, I think why they're stuck is it's hard to get moving from a full stop, right? If this has not been part of your culture, part of your business goals, part of your long-term, short-term, midterm strategy, it can be really hard to know where to begin. And complacency, things have been good enough for now. And when we say good enough, that's often for white people, able-bodied, cisgendered, that it's very hard to move out of that place of comfort. You know, there's a lot of different lists of kind of things to look at, both in your business and sort of looking at your own comfort and positions in the world and how you show up. And one of the ones that comes up a lot in sort of white dominant culture and habits is right to comfort, that we feel like we should be comfortable, that we somehow have an inherent right to that. And doing a lot of this work is uncomfortable. It's growth in general, right? We think about any kind of growth can be really challenging. And so to get ready for that, to expect discomfort, to expect and be available to non-closure, that a lot of this stuff is not going to be wrapped up neatly. I think recently I was in a workshop, and it was like, a lot of people say, well, this is, it's not a sprint, it's a marathon. When we talk about DEI initiatives, it's not a marathon either, because I've run a marathon one, and there was an end. I knew it would end, which was how I got through it. This work doesn't end. I feel like this is one of these words that after a while you're like, oh, we need a new word for this. It's the journey, right? It's going to continue, and new challenges and new obstacles and new opportunities are going to arise all the way along, but we're not going to be done. You know, I'd like to say that we're all going to achieve collective liberation in our lifetime, and we're probably not. So, but what can I do in my own work, whether it's in my business work, in my family, in my community? And so you really do have to figure out, where are my priorities? Where can I make an impact? And start there.
So as I understand it, you're part of the leadership team at Moxie that is implementing this. And I use the active form of that because it's not implemented, it's implementing from what I gather. And then you gave the example of, you know, finding a Black insurance broker or Black owned insurance company to work with. So how did you all at Moxie go about going from sort of, you know, zero forward, getting uncomfortable? What was your strategy? What did the leadership look like? How did you do it?
I think a lot of it, so this is often with Moxie, we have cyclical hiring. So I've actually been employed by Moxie before in the 2018 midterm cycle, and then I left, and then I came back for 2020, and now I'm in a more sort of long-term position. But it really, in the time since I've been affiliated with them at all, Lisa McLean, our founder and CEO, has just really deep clarity and conviction about how important this work is. I think that you have to have buy-in. You have to have buy-in from leadership, and if you don't, you need to find allies and accomplices within your organization, or within, you know, whether it's a peer organization, and find some alliance so that you can really get some traction together. This work is too big and too hard to go it alone. And one person in an organization may be able to have some impact, but without true buy-in from leadership, it's really hard. It's not impossible, but it's really hard. And so I feel super lucky that her conviction about the importance of this work is backed up by budget allocation. That, you know, it's so true. You fund what's important to you, and so I'm able to go deeper into this work, seek out resources, put money behind it as necessary, because I know she has my back. I know she has my back, and the other partners have my back. And I think as I said, it's a continuous reawakening. It's our our own blind spots are blind spots for a reason. And so being available to be called in, sometimes being called out is incredibly hard. And that's my own work, right? Is calling people in and not calling them out. I am not very good at it. And it is my work.
Nice. That's great. So Nyasha, what have you seen as far as, challenges of companies, large and small, to get started and to implement?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of things, Michelle. So I've mentioned that I was part of a DSHS study that was studying why small businesses weren't able to contract with DSHS. So one of the things is status quo, right? Is what we're doing has worked this far. So, I've actually had someone tell me, well, we aren't necessarily looking for diversity. We're just looking for the best candidate, right? And I'm like, if the best candidate didn't actually make it into the room or apply, how do you know you got the best candidate, right? There's no way of knowing. And I think, when we think about diversity, equity, inclusion, it's a very narrow view, right? Because I think because we're all so sensitive to race, that's the first place that we go. And, I think that if we were to break it down, right, there's so many categories that are involved in diversity, equity, inclusion. And Michelle, I'm going to do a screen share of a diversity wheel, just real quick, so we can take a look at it. Because I think people will be surprised how many categories that they actually fit into, right? And you can be white, male, and fit into a number of diverse categories, right? So you could have age as one of the categories that you fall into, gender, sexual orientation, recreational habits, religion, right? So these are all categories which DEI takes into account. I think because we've narrowed our viewpoint so much, we don't really think about the different ways that you can be diverse, right? And I think because of that, it complicates the dialogue, right? Because we're starting at the hardest point of the conversation, right? Which is race. It's the most uncomfortable. It challenges you and what your thoughts are from basically childhood up and all of your family relationships. That's a tough place to start an initiative. But I think if we look at all of these things, we can find ways to approach DEI within our organizations in a way that is meaningful and really allows us to do it in some ways that are less threatening, right? Than going directly to race. Now, of course, here's the beautiful thing, and I have a phenomenal friend of mine, I'll stop sharing this, that founded an organization called Women in Cloud. So we were a staunch supporter of Women in Cloud. Why? Because anything that improves the situation for women ultimately will improve the situation for other minorities, right? So when I formed my organization, we went to Women in Cloud and said, hey, do you guys have IP to help us build this organization? And so our framework and our foundation was built in collaboration, right? And so once that culture of inclusion comes into a company, then it affects everyone equally. And so there are easy ways to get started, right? It doesn't have to be something that's earth-shattering. So, my commitment around diversity and inclusion in my company is that we will make sure that we have diverse rounds of applications, especially for technical roles, right? And so sometimes that involves looking at our candidate pool and saying, hey, we need to reach out to more people to see how we can diversify this, right? But it's steps like that. And it might be like, hey, so the city of Seattle did this, which was, when we do contracts, let's take a look at least one minority vendor out of the 3 vendors we're looking at. You don't have to hire anyone. Hopefully the chance to perform is enough that you go, hey, this is the best of the people that we brought in. But by being intentional, then you can reach out to places to do it. And lastly, because I will ramble on incessantly, one of the challenges that people typically mention is I can't find X. right? So with our community, what we're building is a directory specifically for technology companies. But there are sub-communities. So there's a Black business directory where I noticed in COVID, people would post, as a Facebook group, people would post like, hey, you know, I'm looking for a Black-owned business that does X, right? But I really think plugging into those sub-communities, and a lot of people don't know they exist, right? But we all have sub-communities and sub-networks we belong to, right? Women's Presidents Organization is one. You know, the Chamber's one. All of the, most of the ethnic groups have chambers where they have businesses, right? So there's a Hispanic chamber in Seattle. There's a, let's see, there's Table 100, which essentially functions like a Black Chamber of Commerce. The African Chamber of Commerce exists in Seattle, doing work with Africa. There's an Ethiopian chamber. So all of these groups have sub areas where they congregate, where, you know, you can link in, and because they're doing stuff around business, the next time you have a role open, you can reach in and say, hey, can you market this role for me? Just so it gets a little more reach. And so the constraints really around the, how do I find people? How do I connect with people and those sorts of things? And I am always available. So if you want to connect with me, I may not have the answer, but I guarantee I probably know someone who does. And, you know, it's such a fine line, because a lot of people are like, well, you know, I don't feel like I should reach out, or, you know, my job isn't diversity, equity, inclusion. Most people, the only thing they can say is no. Is if you tell someone that's in a minority group, hey, I'm trying to diversify my talent pool, my vendor pool, my whatever pool, I don't think anyone that's in that classification would really look and say, hey, you know, that's annoying, or get away from me, right? It's like, let me see what I can do to help. And I think that, you know, for Seattle specifically, we have to be bold in asking, right? Because I think people are very timid, because it may, you know, so no, I am not plugged into all the Black people, but if you ask me and I see that you're making a legitimate effort, I'm not going to be upset about it. Yeah, I welcome that, because it shows that things are changing and improving.
I really appreciate that, because I do think that there was something that you said and Juniper said that really sort of struck me. And one is that the best candidate doesn't always make it into the room. And I think that's really on point and very important. And then the second piece was this idea of discomfort. And so, you know, Nyasha, you just mentioned, you know, just, you know, reach out to these organizations and people are willing to help. I think there's a lot of discomfort in reaching out or joining an organization where, you know, you may not feel that you fit because you don't, you know, sit in that demographic. So can you guys talk a little bit about, and maybe Juniper, you were talking about some of the initiatives you have about outreach. How have you gone out to find that best candidate? How have you broadened your ecosystem?
Well, it's a really relevant question right now, because we're in the middle of a hiring process. And I will say, I'm always, I'm so excited and sometimes a little surprised at how many extraordinary resources there are on the web, often that are free. Does it mean they're all good? Absolutely not. But there are some really phenomenal guides, rubrics, to help encourage or expand your way of thinking, particularly about hiring, but I think they're about expanding your business ecosystem in general. You know, you'll often see people saying, well, I posted the job on LinkedIn, or I posted it on Indeed, and I didn't get any diverse candidates, so I'm not sure what else I'm supposed to do. I think whether it's looking into some of these networks, like Nyasha mentioned, which sometimes, depending if you are outside that demographic or that racial identity or that neurotypical, whatever your identities are, if you're outside of that, they can feel invisible to you, but they certainly are out there and very robust, and you kind of have to be really dogged. And you have to decide, this actually is really important. And sometimes that means the process might need to go longer. Or instead of posting the position for a week, you need to post it for a month, so that you are making sure to cast as wide a net as you can. And if you're starting to see applicants come through and they all are kind of showing up the same, then it's time to re-examine your efforts. And it's possible that you could just pause it. If in a lot of businesses, that's not possible for a variety of reasons. But what else can get pushed aside so that you can devote the time and resources it takes to making sure that your applicant pool really is as diverse as possible? We have in our current recruiting efforts, bulk, if not the entirety of our recruiting budget is going to engaging with either a recruiter who specifically works with political operatives of color, or there is a sort of a diversity job fair coming up that I'm super excited about, that an organization called Gain Power is doing for the first time. And so we are, devoting some money into making sure that we are at that event, that we are aligned in the way that we want to show up at that event. And also I went digging, there's a Google group, for everything these days. So like I've just posted all over the place, and it's not willy-nilly. It actually it feels fairly strategic, but it's a lot more robust than any effort we've made before. And that is very intentional. When I look back at sort of the folder of applicants we had before, it's not great, and so what else can I do in particular as the person that's running these searches to make sure that the pool of applicants looks like the electorate that we are trying to persuade? That's at the end of the day. If we are trying to grab attention, if we are trying to move votes, if we are trying to change hearts and minds, it has to be done by people who are representative, who bring new, different, bold ideas to the table, and it can't just be a bunch of white people. That's not what America looks like.
And I was going to, you mentioned, LinkedIn, and something that we talked about in our kind of pre-discussion was, who do you already have in your ecosystem? So if your, LinkedIn is, 95%, non-diverse, whatever category of non-diverse, then your outreach to that group is going to likely result in less diversity than if your outreach is broader than that. Can either of you talk about, how to diversify that particular network, that one-on-one network? So we were talking about, joining different groups. How do we leverage these relationships in a way to build diversity into our broader network?
It's a pretty far-reaching question, Michelle. So, so I'll answer that tangentially because I can't answer it directly. There's a lot there. So one of the pivotal moments for me, at least in the last few years, was, or at least eye-opening moments, was I was at a Rotary meeting and they showed the original NAACP founding board. If you haven't seen this picture, you should, because I was blown away. So here's I'm gonna do a screen share. This is like the least professional screen share ever because it's a website that is. So yeah, let's see. Pull it up. Yeah. Okay, I'll pull it up in a second. I always assumed that the NAACP was founded by a group of Black people, as one would. There are 2 Black people out of 5 on that board. Right. So, when we talk about, so I joined Rotary probably for the reverse reason that, people have trouble connecting with minority groups. Right. So I didn't have a diverse set of people that I knew, right? Because everyone was like me that was around me. I'm like, well, let me join the oldest, whitest organization on the planet. I was so my Rotary Club has an average age of like 65. And it's very old school. They started admitting women, I think, in the 90s. So I'm like, let me diversify my network. Here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to join Rotary. But the beauty is I learned stuff like that, right? Where, you have these assumptions about what it takes, right? And ultimately, it takes all of us. So one-to-one, So I know and Bree Stammer's on the line right now. So I was going to call her out, and I will. But I know that Lisa at Moxie is super invested in this, right? Because she gets the gravity of the situation and what change needs to happen. I know Bree's doing a lot of work with the Microsoft team, and they've developed a phenomenal team of resources that are African American that are working on this African American growth initiative, right? So it is that, you know, you need to reach out and you need to go out and find a pathway into a community, right? And you know, I have one of my favorite people is this guy named John, who's in another organization I belong to. But he asked some really, you know, some questions where, I mean, we had like 7 Black people on a Teams meeting, and John, right? And so he asked, and his question was very honest, right? Is, I'm in Chicago, I'm trying to find Black-owned businesses to partner with. How can I do it? Right. But, you know, that just that vulnerability and being in that room and asking the question is, you know, that helps. So right now we're like, hey, we'll connect you with Jason, who's got family in Chicago, and he's now connected and actively advocating for Black-owned tech firms in Chicago. John is white, in his 50s, but he made the conscious effort to keep going to places where people hang out. You can go to Tabor 100 is a Black, you know, essentially a Black business group. You can go to one of their meetings any given Saturday, once a month. You can go to their gala and support their gala, right? But the first step is deciding you want to do it, and then finding a way to get engaged. Because ultimately, all of us, we have more in common than we have separate. We're all in business, and we're all trying to find a way to make our businesses succeed. And
do you feel, sorry,
yeah.
okay.
No, go ahead.
Say, do you feel that there's more maybe permission to talk about this now than there was a few years back?
I think that so this is just my personal opinion, right? Is I think we've reached a point where people now realize the gravity of these disparities, right? And it's not just in the Black population. If you look at, you know, hiring for disabled people. So I actually talked to a nonprofit that's dealing with this, and he was saying that, like, look, you know, before remote work, this was a great way for people who are disabled to get work, right? Now, when everyone else flips to remote work, it creates a significant amount of competition for people who are disabled. I'm like, I never would have thought about that.
Mm-hmm.
Right. But I think the awareness was definitely elevated through George Floyd and what the country went through. But I think, you know, like I said, with things having that multiple impact, I think, you know, the movement for women and supporting women had already gained steam when that happened. But I think now there is a very conscious effort to look at these things differently than people have in the past. And I think it's awesome.
I think one thing that I do want to say that it's, I think some of it is really hard. I assume most of the folks on this call are in the Seattle area. I think there's, first of all, there's a great fear of getting it wrong, you know, of falling on your face, of either looking like a fool yourself or causing harm, often to folks that have already had a world of harm done to them for a variety of reasons. So people have to be willing to get it wrong. But it's also super important, and I can only say this, you know, in my white, cisgendered, many other identities that I carry with me into each room. It is important that if I'm going to get it wrong, that I am taking steps to mitigate the harm, often by seeking out affinity groups where I can kind of work out my stuff without asking people of color, disabled people, to bear the brunt of my getting it wrong. I think You know, one thing that really comes to mind is a friend of mine is a very, very powerful producer in the commercial Broadway theater. She's in New York. She's incredibly powerful, has huge gatekeeping and power status in that industry. And when George Floyd was murdered and different kinds of conversations started to be happening in her industry, she let us know that she reached out to a Black colleague in her office who was not a peer in terms of her own power and gatekeeping status. And she said, well, what should we do? What can we do? She was burdening a person at a time that was, I mean, it's never okay. But in that particular moment, and I told my friend this, you know, it was unconscionable that she asked this person to lift more, to try and fix something that she had not broken, and without further compensation. You know, if I'm asking somebody to fix a problem that is perhaps not in their scope of work, that is perhaps in fact, bringing more trauma to a situation that's already very difficult, I need to either pay them, give them extra time off. I need to be thinking about ways in which I can mitigate harm, hopefully not do it in the first place, but it can be problematic to ask folks who are oppressed or marginalized to fix a problem and to not understand that is not their job. People may want to be engaged in conversation, but there's a permission, you know, that you have to ask, you know, is having this conversation about ableism something that one of your colleagues who uses a wheelchair, is that a conversation they want to have with you? And if they say no, the answer is no. I think that's super important for people in whatever dominant identity you may carry to remember. It is not those other folks' job to necessarily fix this for you, though they may absolutely want to be a part of the solution. You know, one of my great heroes, Ayanna Pressley, says those who are closest to the pain should be closest to the power. But it is not necessarily appropriate to burden them with fixing something, as I said, that they did not break.
Yeah, and I think, Juniper, the critical point in there is asking for permission, right? So I think there is a certain thing, if you bring something with authenticity, right? I'm really trying to address this. Please, can you help me? You know, I think one of the most interesting questions I've been asked when, you know, when I decided to start a nonprofit, which I've never done before, and you know, someone asked me, how are you going to do this? And I'm like, you know, to be honest, I don't know. However, I know that I can find people that could do a phenomenal job of this, right? And so, you know, I think with any of that request for solutions, it is that thing where you can request access because that's something that I have just by default. You can ask me if I want to help share my access to the communities I have with you. But as far as, you know, actual solutions, I mean, you can get my ideas and input. But those are just one person's ideas and input, right? So, but yeah, ask for permission, be vulnerable, and authentically engage in a way that says, I am trying to help this situation. I think the biggest discovery I've had recently, so, you know, people on this call, regardless of how big the organization is, everyone is shell-shocked at how little they've done around these issues in the past, right? It's not a small business issue. I've met execs at very large companies that are overwhelmed, you know, because we asked the question, and, you know, I'm not going to ask it in this room, but I'm like, yeah, how many black tech entrepreneurs do you know? This is within the technology space, right? If I ask most people, like, how many black business owners do you know? For people to get past one or two is minimal. If I'm asking the question and I take myself out of the mix, then it quickly goes to zero. Yeah, so Washington State's population is kind of different. So it goes to reason that most people would not unless they intentionally made an effort. But you know the reason I acted and formed the organization I did was I was looking around for Black-owned businesses in Vegas at Microsoft's conference, and especially African-American ones, right? Because that's a subcategory in Black. There was no one. I went for 3 days of that conference. I met people from Trinidad, South Africa, wherever. There was no one. And so when I stood up the organization, I'm like, I personally can't live in a world where this is what this looks like. This is one of the greatest opportunities we've had economically. And so that was my call to action. Like everyone that's here is that view of, I see something so egregious, I need to act. I don't need to know how to act, but I know I need to do something about it. And the fact that you can start within your businesses, I think, is phenomenal. And, you know, feel free to make mistakes. Just bring it from a point of humility and authenticity and a legitimate effort to support. And I think it'll be received well.
I really like this permission, this vulnerability. And it seems interesting to me that within an organization, as you begin to plan for and execute on a diversity or DEI strategy, you're asking for, it seems you're asking for a lot of vulnerability from your team. And so where's the balance between rolling something out as a, you know, top-down policy / mandate to the permission and vulnerability and making mistakes piece of this? How is that navigated within a company?
I'll let Juniper answer that one.
Thank you so much. I mean, what's that expression? Culture eats strategy for breakfast. You know, the culture that you build it together every day. And if you are a culture where people are not safe to be vulnerable, where people are not safe to bring their true authentic selves to work, then these conversations are going to be harder. They're going to be really hard. I think there are, you know, it is a core value that we've spent a lot of time trying to figure out how to articulate for ourselves at Moxie about what does it mean to bring your whole self to work. And Microsoft, since Nyasha has brought them up a few times, they recently had a all day, I think it was even like 14-hour webinar that was free, that was nothing short of extraordinary. The caliber of speakers, because they have access to them, was unbelievable. And I did one session about covering, and I'd never heard this used as a term. And I was like, oh, that's what it is. When broadly, it's how you, what you have to do to hide or shrink the parts of yourself when it is not actually accepted or welcome to bring your whole self to work. And lots of people with lots of different identities are out there covering all the time. You may see a white, middle-aged, heterosexual man who's leading a company who may be struggling at home because their kid has a chronic illness, or there's addiction in their house, and people are working so hard to cover those parts of themselves to show up in this very narrow way that we've all collectively decided is professional or appropriate or adult or any of those words. And if people want to keep those things to themselves and keep it private, obviously we want them to be able to do that. But the way that I want to show up to work is with my full self. And I was in a job once, I mostly have come from the nonprofit sector, but I was the only person there over 40, and I was the only person there who was a parent. And my parenting self was not welcome at work. That I had to leave by 3 o'clock to get my kid at the bus. You know, I would be online and doing work from home before anybody else and back at it after my kids had gone to bed. But that was invisible to the other folks in the organization. All they could see was that Juniper has to leave at 3 o'clock. And isn't that a bummer? And also, so then she doesn't go and have a drink with us after work, or she's not available to do these other things. And bit by bit, I just kind of didn't talk about it anymore, you know? And my children, you know, not surprisingly, are the great, extraordinary manifestation of my joy in this world. And to not be able to bring that part of myself to work it cost me. It cost me too much, and eventually I couldn't stay there anymore. And that's one example of a way that I started covering. And it's very possible, if you have a culture that is not deeply and radically and vulnerably committed to people being able, as they want, to bring their whole selves to work, you are missing out in your culture. And you will start to see attrition. You will start to see sort of a level of, you will pay for it one way or another. And so that culture where people are allowed to have difficult conversations, where people are not called out, people are called in, that is a really exciting place to work. And it's a place I want to stay. That's an investment I want to make in my own career, in my own growth. And then because of that, Moxie doesn't have to seek out a way to start a new job search for people because they're leaving because they can't bring their whole selves to work. That actually has a dollar cost. We know this. When people are leaving your organization because their identity is not welcome, whether explicitly or implicitly, and their lived experience is not welcome.
Yeah, thank you for that. I want to invite questions in the chat. We have more to talk about here, but if anyone has questions, feel free to pop those into the chat, and we'll address those as well in the last 15 minutes or so here. One thing that we had talked about, going back to the idea of vendors, I really appreciate all the vulnerability in this particular part of this program, because I think that that is so core to what we're doing here. But from a more practical standpoint, large companies do RFPs, RFQs. So Nyasha, you mentioned this, the city of Seattle is now, we need to have at least one minority candidate in our pool of RFPs.
Yeah.
Can small businesses do that? Because typically what they do is they say, hey, I know Joe, and Joe probably knows somebody, and Joe's typically, similar demographic from the person asking, and Joe is referring someone who's a similar demographic to Joe, and so we don't get there. But could we use an RFP type process like Seattle does, or is that just too much?
So there's two ways to look at that, right? So and then Michelle, we won an RFP, which we essentially wrote, which is how, actually this is out in public, so I probably shouldn't talk about that. Yeah, so my friend's actually in a similar situation, right? So the RFP process itself, typically RFPs are written by the close vendor, right? Essentially, in a lot of categories. So even that system has its flaws. The only thing I'd say is when you do go out to bid, that it's called the Rooney Rule that was instantiated in football, right? Because they had 0 black coaches. But they said just interview one, right? You can give it to your best friend, but just interview one before you give it to, right? And you might be surprised. So when I arrived here, I arrived in '94. There was 0 black coaches. We had one for a few years, and eventually a few more. But I think in a small business, that's something that you could do, right? So we intentionally, so up until when was it? I don't know, expose how ancient, how long the business has been running. But probably about 7 or 8 years ago, we put out an ad, and the same, we'd have 55 to 60-year-old white guys who had worked at Microsoft as contractors apply 100% of the time. So we actually had our interviews in person, and that's who was in the room consistently. And we switched that. So our last round that we hired for a tech, after all of the interviews, our finalists, we had two women finalists who were phenomenal, and one guy. We ended up hiring the guy at that point in time. But we had people in the room, right? And that's my commitment as a small business owner. Is I just need to get people in the room, whether I choose them or not, is up to me. And I think that's an easy commitment that we can all make and follow through on.
Nyasha, can I ask, is there a line that you can identify or you've experienced where that tips into tokenism?
But again, so we're looking for the best candidates. I just need to get them in my pool. It's not like we're not qualifying people. We're qualifying people based on gender or other criteria. We're just making sure that the pipeline has those people in, right? So there's probably 20 people in that pool. It goes down to 3 finalists, and then we get to 1. So, in that scenario, I don't think so. I can see how it would be the case. I think, we all want to get, no one's like, yeah, I want to get a contractor because, I'm a minority vendor. I mean, that's not how it works, right? You've got people that are very high performers. The same thing with people who are out there looking for jobs. So yes, that is a risk. However, I think if you're really filtering on the right criteria, it shouldn't be a problem.
Great. So as we wrap up here, Nyasha, I'm going to ask you to share a story that you mentioned during our initial call about kind of unexpected kind of externalities. You mentioned sort of by hiring a particular company, it resulted in other folks being positively impacted. Do you remember the story? I'll tell it if not.
Can you start it for me and then I might remember?
Yeah, you just mentioned a situation where, and I don't know if it was City of Seattle, if it was a different company, but
yeah,
by hiring a minority company to do the work, that resulted in a number of job additions.
Yeah, that was us. Thank you for teeing it up, Michelle. Apparently, I talk a lot. So
I just think it's great because I think that's the stuff we don't consider when we think about the ecosystem, right? The ecosystem is this one person that we've affected, when ultimately by taking these actions and every time getting someone in the room, that the overall effect, you talk about the disparity of the data, the overall effect is a much greater impact.
I'll talk to that because that's that to me is what what makes the work that we're talking about really cool. So we got an opportunity to bid for the City of Seattle contract that Insights had out of Chicago for years. And basically the City of Seattle at that point is shipping computers to Chicago to get imaged by this company. And they return them with errors pretty much 100% of the time. So the Fleets and Facilities Department has these issues. So we come in as one of 3 vendors. So it was us, Insight, and then one other vendor. For Insight, obviously, it was a small deal. They didn't really care about it. So I almost didn't bid on it when they called because they're like, hey, we're looking at the consultants roster. We need 1 diverse supplier in this thing. I'm like, never mind, I don't do RFPs. And so we went in and then they gave 1 sample to secure. So we secured it, we sent it back. And so they called and said, hey, we want to use your proposal to put together the RFP for this because we need to run an informal competition. So they ran the competition. Obviously, we ended up with the bid. And so I sat down and I asked, because at that point it was the Chief Information Security Officer for the City of Seattle is the one who had put out the bid. Well, like, what was the differentiator? And he said, look, not only did you guys get the system locked down the way that we asked for it, you made additional recommendations and additional improvements that really affected the process and improved the process, and we think would cut down on the errors. So we're going to go with you. And so I'm like, cool. And so we did that. They extended it for a couple of years. So the net result, so the City of Seattle ended up saving money because they were shipping these machines to Chicago with frequency to get them done. The people that were working the Fleets and Facilities team were more efficient. We were able to hire a kid from a program called Year Up Puget Sound, which was at that point trying to get people that were making minimum wage to $15 an hour. So we hired him at $15 an hour before the minimum wage. And he ended up going to, he worked with us for a bit. We were able to hire him specifically because of this contract. He's working at HTC now. Young guy, single mom, went from, doing the minimum wage job. I would guess he's probably at about $30 an hour right now or more, over a 2 to 3 year period. And so when we look at the opportunity for dollars, that contract might have been like $75,000. But if you look downstream at the implications, and then, you know, you fast forward to his ability to continue to engage and bring his siblings out of poverty and into opportunity. Those are the things that, you know, when we're spending money, we need to think through that there's these massive downstream impacts, even if your direct engagement is not huge. You know, each one builds to allow for massive impact in the future.
Great. Juniper, do you have any final kind of wrap up thoughts as we have key takeaways?
I mean, I see, can I address the question that I see in the Q&A?
Absolutely. Go ahead.
I recently read that Black applicants are judged on their resume versus what a white person may know. I know I've seen this in hiring managers. I've also seen it with how women are viewed. Thoughts? Not surprisingly, I have a lot of thoughts. You know, I think people in a hiring role can do a lot to strip out people's identities. There are lots of either software that you can avail yourself of if you have the money for it. If you don't, you literally can print things out and stick tape over people's names and recopy it before you send it around if you are using a hiring panel, so that people's names, their gender, there are other things that you can remove from assessing resumes, because it is true. It's absolutely true that in many industries, if you have what's familiarly just referred to as a Black sounding name, in some industries, your credentials will not be viewed with the same lens as a white sounding name. If you are committed in your organization to stopping that, not just mitigating it, stopping it in your organization, there are some fairly simple and pretty low tech steps you can take to stop that practice. I think having a diverse group of people look at your resumes, look at your applicant pool, and if that diversity doesn't exist in your organization right now, reach out. Is there another organization that you do work with and you can say, hey, I feel like I need somebody else on this panel to help me kind of illuminate my blind spots. Are you willing to sit on this panel with us? Compensate them for their time if that's appropriate, and have a fresh set of eyes on your round of candidates. Or if you have people on your in your candidate pool who identify as trans, is there someone in your wider community that identifies as trans that is also willing to sit, so that you can make someone feel more at ease, more seen? There are steps you can take so that you are not continually re-upping in othering candidates, which puts them at a disadvantage.
Thank you. So I'm going to wrap up here because I know folks have upcoming meetings and such.
Michelle, can I have 10 seconds?
Yes.
Okay, cool.
Absolutely.
I'm going to post, I love Pixar. Pixar did a video called Pearl a few years ago. If anyone hasn't watched it, it's really cool. But, you know, when you look at inclusion and having people bring their full selves and really look at the richness of what that brings, this is a great, it's PURL is the spelling, but it's definitely worth a watch. It's about 8 to 10 minutes.
Thank you for that. So, thanks to Nyasha and Juniper for your vulnerability and your openness, and for sharing both tactical and strategic thinking around this topic. It's so important, and I know that so many small businesses are kind of stuck trying to figure out how to start and how to not make mistakes and how to be vulnerable in this space. So I really, really do appreciate that. And as I mentioned, the program will be posted and available for you all. You'll get a follow-up email, and in the contact information for both Juniper and Nyasha will be included in that. Just real quick, our upcoming programs in July, we're covering trends in taxation. You may have seen that both at the federal level and at the state level, there are a number of tax changes that are proposed or being implemented. So we've got CPA joining us for that conversation. And then August 19th, get ready for Washington's new Long-Term Care Act. This is a little on the later side of probably when you should be talking about it. It's something you should be talking about now. And if you are interested in learning more, you haven't heard of this before, please reach out to me. I'm happy to share resources on this. But we wanted to really kind of push out what employers should know. It doesn't affect employers directly, but it affects your entire team. And so there's real value in sharing with them what the impact and implications are of this to them. So that's coming up in August as well. So again, wanted to say thanks so much for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.